August 1942. The Japanese Empire has never lost a single land battle in the Pacific. Not one. Their Marines are considered unstoppable. Their jungle fighters are the terror of Asia. And every military expert in the world agrees on one thing. White soldiers cannot beat them in close combat. Then something happens on a muddy airstrip in New Guinea that changes everything. Australian soldiers, and not the elite ones, not the famous desert rats, but militia troops that their own generals called chocolate soldiers, do the impossible. They stop the Japanese war machine cold. They hand Tokyo its first land defeat of the entire war. They prove every expert wrong. And then, their own government buries the story. Why? What happened at Milne Bay that was so dangerous to talk about? Why did MacArthur's headquarters work overtime to make sure this victory never made headlines? Why was the general who won the battle investigated instead of promoted? And why were the soldiers who saved Australia treated like an embarrassment when they came home? I have spent months digging into this story. What I found made me angry. It made me proud. And it made me realize that the greatest cover-up in Australian military history has nothing to do with defeat. It has to do with victory. A victory so complete, so undeniable that it embarrassed the most powerful men in the Pacific. And they made sure you never heard about it. Until now. Stay with me to the end of this one. Because what these men did in the rain and mud of Milne Bay and what was done to them afterward is a story every Australian needs to hear. The truth has been buried for 80 years. Today, we dig it up. The heroes Australia forgot. The rain had been falling for 11 days straight when the Japanese landing barges scraped onto the black volcanic sand of Milne Bay. It was the 25th of August, 1942, and the men waiting in the dripping jungle had been told one thing by their American allies. You cannot hold this place. Pull back. Save what you can. The Australians did not pull back. What happened over the next 2 weeks would become the first land defeat of the Japanese Empire in the entire Pacific War. Not Midway, not Guadalcanal. Milne Bay. Australian soldiers, many of them written off as garrison troops, unfit for real combat, stopped the invincible Japanese war machine dead in its tracks. They did it with rusted rifles, borrowed Kitty Hawk fighters, and a stubbornness that would later embarrass 3 separate governments. But here is the part they never told you. When the victory cables reached Brisbane, MacArthur's headquarters did something extraordinary. They buried the story. They downplayed it. They made sure that when the world heard about Japan's first defeat, the name Milne Bay barely registered. Why? Because the heroes were Australian. And in August of 1942, Australia was supposed to be the grateful junior partner. Not the headline. This is the story of the men who won a battle that changed the war, and the conspiracy of silence that followed them home. But first, you need to understand just how terrified Australia was in that winter of 1942. To understand what happened at Milne Bay, you need to understand what Australia looked like in those desperate months. The country was genuinely, historically terrified in a way that no Australian generation before or since has experienced. Singapore had fallen in February. 15,000 Australian soldiers had marched into Japanese captivity. The impregnable fortress that Britain had promised would protect Australia had crumbled in a week, and that was only the beginning of the nightmare. Darwin had been bombed. Japanese submarines had shelled Sydney Harbour. The Brisbane Line, a secret plan to abandon everything north of Brisbane to the enemy, was being whispered about in Canberra. The Japanese had landed at Gona in July. They were pushing down the Kokoda track. Port Moresby, the last barrier before Australia itself, seemed ready to fall. Every newspaper in the country was running maps showing the shrinking distance between the enemy and home. 300 miles, 200 miles, 150. Into this atmosphere of barely controlled panic, a decision was made. Milne Bay, a remote inlet at the eastern tip of New Guinea, would be turned into an airbase. The location was strategic. Aircraft from Milne Bay could strike Japanese shipping lanes. They could support the desperate fighting on the Kokoda track. They could, if everything went wrong, provide a last foothold on New Guinea itself. But there was a problem that would nearly doom the entire operation. The troops sent to build and defend this vital base were not the cream of the Australian military. They were the leftovers. The garrison at Milne Bay was built around two militia brigades, the 18th Brigade and the 7th Brigade. In the strict hierarchy of the Australian Army in 1942, these men occupied the bottom rung. The militiamen were called chocos, short for chocolate soldiers. The insult implied they would melt under fire. Unlike the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, the volunteer professionals who had fought in North Africa and Greece, the militia were conscripts. They could not be deployed outside Australian territory. They had never seen combat. Their equipment was old, their training was rushed, and their officers, in many cases, had been promoted simply because someone had to be in charge. What the brass thought of these men would prove to be spectacularly wrong. The regular army looked down on them. MacArthur's staff dismissed them as garrison troops, useful for digging latrines and guarding supply dumps. When intelligence reports suggested the Japanese might attempt a landing at Milne Bay, the American response was skeptical. Even if they come, the assessment read, the militia cannot be expected to offer serious resistance. But someone disagreed. Major General Cyril Close arrived at Milne Bay in mid-August to take command. He was a professional soldier. He had commanded artillery in the First World War. He understood what the Americans and the Brisbane headquarters did not. These chocolate soldiers might surprise everyone. He just needed time to prepare them. He would not get it. And what was coming would test every man to his absolute limit. The Japanese plan for Milne Bay was characteristically ambitious. A naval landing force of nearly 2,000 men, elite Marines from the Kure and Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Forces, would seize the airstrips in a lightning assault. Once established, they would be reinforced. Milne Bay would become a Japanese air base, and Port Moresby would be squeezed from two directions simultaneously. The force that embarked from Rabaul on the 24th of August was supremely confident. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the Rikusentai, the naval infantry that had swept through the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines like a typhoon. They had never been defeated in a ground assault. Their officers assured them this operation would be complete within 3 days. They expected to find a few hundred disorganized Australians cowering in the rain. They expected token resistance followed by rapid collapse. They expected what the Japanese military had experienced everywhere else in the Pacific since December 1941. What they found instead would shatter every assumption they had ever made about Australian soldiers. The landing began just after midnight on the 26th of August. 7 barges and 2 larger transport ships ground onto the beaches at Wagga Wagga, about 10 kilometers east of the main Australian positions. The rain was torrential. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The Japanese Marines poured off their craft and pushed inland, expecting to reach the airstrips by dawn. They made it about 400 meters before the first shots came from the darkness. The Australian defenders at the eastern perimeter were men of the 61st Battalion, Militia, Chocos, the soldiers that Brisbane had written off. And they did not run. What followed was 12 days of fighting that rewrote every assumption about Australian militia forces. about jungle warfare, about the supposed invincibility of Japanese Marines, about who owned the Pacific War. But the brass in Brisbane did not see it that way, and their blindness would become one of the great scandals of Australian military history. The fighting at Milne Bay was unlike anything the Australian Army had experienced. It was not the open desert of North Africa, where visibility stretched for miles and tanks decided battles. It was not the organized retreats of Greece and Crete. It was close-range slaughter in mud so deep it swallowed men to their waists. It was knife fights in sago swamps. It was Japanese infiltrators screaming in English to cause panic. It was Australian soldiers holding their fire until the enemy was 10 feet away because they could not afford to waste ammunition. And above everything else, it was the rain. The endless, maddening, suffocating rain. The average rainfall at Milne Bay in August 1942 was over 300 millimeters. The airstrips turned into bogs. The jungle tracks became rivers. Wounded men drowned in shell craters filled with water. The humidity rotted leather, jammed weapons, and turned every cut into a festering sore. The mosquitoes came in clouds so thick they darkened the torches of men trying to navigate at night. Both sides suffered in the conditions, but the Australians had one advantage the Japanese did not expect. They had nowhere to go. Singapore had taught them what surrender meant. The stories filtering back from the prisoner camps, the starvation, the brutality, the random executions had reached every unit in New Guinea. For the men at Milne Bay, defeat was not an option that led to comfortable captivity. It led to something far worse. So they fought with a desperation that shocked the Japanese commanders. And what happened at KB Mission would prove it. The first major engagement came at KB Mission, a cluster of plantation buildings about 5 kilometers from the airstrips. On the night of the 27th of August, the Japanese pushed forward in strength, expecting the Australians to fall back as they had been told colonial troops always did. Instead, the 61st Battalion held. The fighting was hand-to-hand in places. Men used bayonets, rifle butts, and fists when their weapons jammed in the mud. The Japanese brought up light tanks, their first use of armor in the New Guinea campaign, but the vehicles bogged down in the swampy ground. Australian gunners knocked out several with Boy's anti-tank rifles, weapons that were considered obsolete against European armor but proved adequate against the thinly protected Japanese machines. By dawn on the 28th, the Japanese had advanced barely a kilometer. Their timetable was already in ruins. But the good news did not reach Brisbane. Or rather, it reached Brisbane and was not believed. And that disbelief would have consequences that haunted the veterans for decades. The communications from Milne Bay during the battle present a study in headquarters incompetence. General Clowes, trying to coordinate a defense across 20 kilometers of jungle in constant rain, sent reports that were cautious and professional. He noted enemy strength. He requested reinforcements. He described the situation as serious but manageable. MacArthur's staff read these reports and panicked. Within 48 hours of the landing, headquarters in Brisbane was convinced that Milne Bay was lost. Staff officers began planning evacuation procedures. Cables were sent to Canberra, warning of an imminent disaster. The Australian government prepared statements acknowledging the fall of the base. Meanwhile, the actual soldiers at Milne Bay were winning. The disconnect between reality and headquarters fantasy would become one of the most shameful episodes in Australian military administration. But the real turning point was still coming, and it would arrive on the night of the 31st of August. The Japanese had committed their full strength to a final push toward No. 3 airstrip, the main prize. If they could capture it, they could fly in reinforcements and turn the battle decisively in their favor. The assault began after dark, with Marines advancing in waves behind their surviving tanks. The Australians waiting for them included something new. The 18th Brigade had been reinforced by the 2nd 12th Battalion, AIF veterans who had been rushed forward from the rear areas. These were professional soldiers who had fought in North Africa. They had experience the militia lacked. And they had something else, a cold anger at being told the situation was hopeless. The battle lasted all night, and it was fought with a savagery that neither side would forget. At several points, Japanese Marines broke through the forward positions and reached the edge of the airstrip itself. Australian counterattacks, some of them organized on the spot by NCOs whose officers had become casualties, pushed them back. The Kitty Hawk fighters that had been grounded by the weather managed to get airborne at first light on the 1st of September and strafed the Japanese positions mercilessly. By noon, the Japanese offensive was broken. They did not know it yet. Neither did Brisbane. But the Battle of Milne Bay was effectively over. What followed was the methodical destruction of an enemy that had believed itself invincible. The Australian advance that pushed the surviving Japanese back toward their landing beaches was not glamorous work. It was slow, bloody fighting through jungle that gave up nothing easily. Every palm log might hide a sniper. Every clearing might be an ambush site. The Japanese were perishing, not just from Australian bullets, but from disease, starvation, and the conditions that made Milne Bay a nightmare for both sides. The reinforcements they had been promised never arrived. The barges that were supposed to evacuate them were turned back by Australian aircraft. By the 5th of September, the original landing force of nearly 2,000 men had been reduced to a few hundred survivors clinging to the beach. On the night of the 6th, Japanese destroyers finally managed to evacuate the remnants. They left behind nearly 800 of their comrades. Australia had won, but you would not have known it from the headlines, and the betrayal was only beginning. The official communiques released by MacArthur's headquarters in the days following the Japanese evacuation were masterpieces of careful omission. The victory at Milne Bay was acknowledged. The Japanese defeat was noted, but the language was restrained. The emphasis was muted, and the heroes, the Australian soldiers who had achieved what no other Allied force had managed, were treated as supporting players in a larger American story. Part of this was simple politics. MacArthur needed victories. His reputation, shattered by the Philippines disaster, required rebuilding. The narrative he was constructing of American power slowly crushing the Japanese empire did not have room for Australian headliners. Milne Bay was useful as a data point. It was not useful as a legend. But there was something else operating as well. Something uglier. Something that would destroy the career of the man who had actually won the battle. General Close, the commander who had orchestrated the victory, found himself under investigation almost immediately after the shooting stopped. The charge, never formally stated but clearly understood, was that he had been too cautious, that his reports had been too pessimistic, that he had nearly caused a loss of confidence in Brisbane with his careful professional assessments of a difficult situation. The investigation found nothing actionable. Clowes had won the battle. His decisions had been sound. His deployment of limited forces had been skillful. But the damage to his career was done. He would never command a major operation again. He was shuffled sideways into administrative roles and retired quietly after the war. The message was clear. If you won a battle but embarrassed the brass in the process, the brass would have its revenge. And if that was how they treated the general, imagine how they treated the ordinary soldiers. The treatment of the men who had actually done the fighting was, if anything, worse. The soldiers who had fought at Milne Bay were not decorated with the generosity their achievement deserved. The militia units, the chocos who had held the line in the first critical days, returned to duties that suggested their performance had been merely adequate rather than extraordinary. The veterans of North Africa, who had reinforced them, were quickly moved to other operations where their experience was needed. No victory parade was organized, no special recognition was granted. The battle that had proved Australian troops could defeat the best Japan had to offer was allowed to fade into the background noise of a war that still had years to run. Part of this was the tempo of the conflict. Kokoda was still raging. Guadalcanal was consuming American attention. There was no time for celebration when the next crisis was always 24 hours away. But part of it was deliberate, and the reasons reveal everything about how Australia saw itself in 1942. The politics of the Pacific War required careful management of national egos. Australia needed American support. American industry, American ships, American aircraft were essential to the defense of the continent. MacArthur, whatever his faults, was the commander who had brought those resources to Australia when they were desperately needed. Antagonizing MacArthur by celebrating an Australian victory too loudly was considered unwise. Prime Minister Curtin and his government made a calculation. The alliance with America mattered more than the pride of the Milne Bay veterans. So the story was downplayed. The headlines went elsewhere, and the men who had changed the course of the Pacific War learned to live with being forgotten. But the Japanese knew the truth, and their reaction tells you everything about what the Australians had actually achieved. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo was stunned by the news from Milne Bay. The naval landing forces, the elite of the elite, had been destroyed by garrison troops. The assumption that white soldiers could not fight in the jungle had been shattered. The timetable for the conquest of New Guinea, already stretched by the stubborn Australian resistance on the Kokoda track, was now in ruins. The commander of the Milne Bay operation, Commander Shojiro Hayashi, did not survive to file a report. He was among the casualties evacuated on the last destroyers. But the surviving officers told their superiors the truth. The Australians had fought with unexpected ferocity. Their air support had been decisive. Their willingness to engage in close combat had negated Japanese advantages in jungle warfare training. Milne Bay, the Japanese High Command concluded, was a warning. The easy conquests were over. The Pacific War had entered a new phase. But that conclusion stayed in Japanese intelligence files. It did not reach the Australian public, and the silence would last for decades. The veterans of Milne Bay returned to their units and their lives with a curious burden. They had participated in something historic. They knew it. The enemy knew it. Their own command structure refused to acknowledge it. The effect on morale was subtle but corrosive. Men who had proved themselves under the worst possible conditions found themselves still treated as second-class soldiers. The militia stigma did not disappear with victory. If anything, the embarrassment of Brisbane, which had prepared to announce a defeat that never came, made the brass more determined to forget the whole episode. Stories emerged later in memoirs and interviews of militiamen being told by AIF regulars that Milne Bay did not really count, that the Japanese force had been weak, that the conditions had favored the defenders, that a real battle would have gone differently. None of these claims survived scrutiny. But myths fade slowly, and the myth of the chocolate soldier persisted long after the chocolate soldiers had proved themselves in blood and mud. What Milne Bay should have changed was how Australia thought about its own military, and eventually, quietly, it did. The transformation of Australian military thinking after Milne Bay is one of the great unwritten stories of the Pacific War. Before the battle, the assumption in Allied headquarters was that jungle warfare required specialized training that Australian troops lacked. The Japanese, with their experience in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, were considered jungle masters. The best hope for defending New Guinea was air power and naval interdiction, not infantry combat. Milne Bay changed that calculation. It proved that Australian soldiers, even undertrained militia, could match the Japanese in their supposedly invincible environment. It proved that air-ground coordination in jungle conditions was possible and devastating. It proved that the psychological weapon of Japanese momentum could be broken. Every subsequent operation in New Guinea built on these lessons: the victories at Buna and Gona, the destruction of the Japanese garrison at Salamaua, the liberation of the Huon Peninsula. All of them traced their tactical and psychological roots to what had happened at Milne Bay. But the official histories were slow to acknowledge this debt. The credit went elsewhere, and the men who had paid for the lessons in blood received nothing but silence. The 50th anniversary of Milne Bay in 1992 brought a modest re-evaluation. Veterans who had kept their silence for decades began speaking publicly. Historians who had access to Japanese records confirmed what the Australians had always known: that the defeat at Milne Bay had shocked Tokyo and contributed directly to the eventual Japanese withdrawal from Papua New Guinea. Prime Minister Keating attended a commemorative ceremony. The soldiers, now old men, received the acknowledgement they had been denied half a century earlier. Some wept. Others maintained the stoic silence that had been their armor since 1942. But 50 years is a long time. Many of the men who had fought in the rain and mud were already gone. Their stories had been passed to children and grandchildren, but the living connection to the battle was fading. And the question remained: why was Milne Bay forgotten while Kokoda became legendary? The answer deserves an examination. Part of it is narrative simplicity. The Kokoda track offered a story that was easy to tell: a single path through the mountains, a retreating force that rallied, a dramatic reversal. The imagery was powerful: the golden stairs, the fuzzy-wuzzy angels, the endless mud and misery. Milne Bay was messier. The fighting was dispersed across multiple axes. The terrain was flat jungle rather than dramatic mountains. The sequence of events was confusing even to participants. There was no single iconic image that captured the battle's meaning. But narrative simplicity does not explain everything. Other complex battles have been remembered. Other flat terrains have produced legends. The deeper answer lies in the politics of memory. Kokoda was safe to commemorate because it did not embarrass anyone who mattered. The British were not involved. MacArthur's reputation was not at stake. The story could be told without uncomfortable questions about headquarters, incompetence, or allied rivalries. Milne Bay was different. Remembering Milne Bay meant remembering that Brisbane had panicked, that MacArthur's staff had dismissed the defenders as doomed, that the official reaction to victory had been to investigate the commander rather than celebrate him. Some histories are forgotten because they are unimportant. Others are forgotten because they are inconvenient. Milne Bay fell into the second category, and the pattern would repeat itself throughout Australian military history. The parallel to other forgotten victories is instructive and infuriating. The Rats of Tobruk spent 8 months holding a fortress that everyone said could not be held. Their reward was to be pulled out of the line and replaced by British troops who promptly lost most of the gains the Australians had made. The myth of Tobruk survives, but the bitterness survives alongside it. The knowledge that Australian achievement was downplayed to protect British reputations. The Battle of Long Tan in Vietnam saw 108 Australians defeat a force 10 times their size. The battle was classified for years. The soldiers received their medals in a private ceremony. The government was too nervous about domestic opposition to the war to celebrate a victory properly. Milne Bay fits this pattern. Australian soldiers achieve something extraordinary. The political circumstances make celebration awkward. The heroes are asked to be quiet about their heroism. The pattern is so consistent that it might be called a national tradition, not the fighting, but the forgetting. And the men who paid the price for that tradition deserve better. What would proper recognition of Milne Bay have looked like? Other nations have managed to celebrate their turning point victories without false modesty. Midway is a household name in America. El Alamein is remembered in Britain. Stalingrad needs no explanation to any Russian. Milne Bay deserved the same treatment, a full public accounting of the battle within weeks of its conclusion. Medals distributed generously to the units that had held the line. General Claus promoted rather than investigated. The militia stigma publicly rejected by senior commanders who acknowledged that the Chocos had become soldiers. None of this happened. The opportunity was lost in 1942 and never recovered. The veterans moved on. They fought other battles. They came home to jobs and families and the ordinary concerns of peacetime life. They joined RSL clubs and marched on Anzac Day with men who had fought at Tobruk and Kokoda and a dozen other places that the public remembered better. When asked about Milne Bay, they told their stories, but they told them quietly to audiences of one or two rather than to the nation. And now, most of them are gone. The living veterans of Milne Bay are now almost entirely past. The last verified survivor of the original garrison left us in 2019. With him went the first-hand memory of what those 12 days had meant. What remains are the records, the war diaries kept by battalion commanders in waterproof cases as the rain fell endlessly, the after-action reports filed by officers who knew their words would be second-guessed by staff officers who had never heard a shot fired in anger, the medical records documenting the hundreds of casualties, tropical diseases nearly as numerous as bullet wounds, and the letters. Soldiers wrote home from Milne Bay with the casual understatement that has always characterized Australian military correspondence. The fighting is hot, but we are holding. The Japs are good, but we are better. Do not worry about me. These letters, preserved in archives and family collections, provide a counter-narrative to the official silence. They prove that the men who fought at Milne Bay knew exactly what they had accomplished. They did not need Brisbane or Canberra to tell them they had won. They had the evidence of their own survival. And in Papua New Guinea itself, the memory never faded at all. On the beaches of Milne Bay today, the jungle has reclaimed most of the battleground. The airstrips are overgrown. The defensive positions have collapsed into the mud. The only markers of what happened there are a few memorials maintained by veterans associations and the local population. Papua New Guinean guides take visitors through the sites and tell the story of the battle that their own ancestors witnessed. They speak of the Australians with respect. They remember that the soldiers who fought in their jungle did not treat them as inferiors. They remember the courage. These local memories have preserved what official Australian memory nearly lost. In the villages around Milne Bay, the significance of the battle never faded because the people who lived there understood what defeat would have meant for them. This is perhaps the final irony. The victory that Australia downplayed is celebrated in Papua New Guinea. The heroes that Canberra forgot are remembered in the place where they fought, and the question the veterans asked most often remains unanswered. The question that the Milne Bay veterans asked most often in their later years was simple. Why were we not good enough to be remembered? The answer had nothing to do with their performance. They had been magnificent. They had done everything that was asked of them and more. They had defeated an enemy that was supposed to be unbeatable on terrain that was supposed to favor the attacker. The answer had to do with politics, with alliance management, with the insecurities of a nation that was not sure it deserved to be taken seriously. with staff officers who had been wrong and could not admit it. None of these explanations satisfied the veterans. They went to their graves with the questions still unanswered. Perhaps this account, decades too late, is part of the answer. The recognition comes now because the obstacles to recognition have faded. The alliance with America no longer requires Australian self-effacement. The staff officers who protected their reputations are long since past. The truth can be told without embarrassing anyone except the historians who failed to tell it earlier. Milne Bay was the first land defeat of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific War. Australian soldiers, militia, and AIF alike achieved what the combined forces of Britain, America, and the Netherlands had failed to achieve anywhere else since December 1941. They did it with inadequate supplies, obsolete equipment, and leadership from Brisbane that ranged from incompetent to actively hostile. They did it because they understood that surrender was not an option, that the enemy would not show mercy, that the only way home was through. They did it and were told to be quiet about it. The silence ends now. The heroes that Australia forgot deserve to be remembered. Milne Bay was their victory. It changed the war. And their names, the names of men from the 61st Battalion, the 2nd 12th Battalion, the 7th Brigade, the 18th Brigade, belong in the same sentence as any soldiers who ever wore Australian uniform. They were not chocolate soldiers. They were the men who stopped an empire. The brass did not give them medals. History gives them something better: the truth. They held when everyone expected them to break. They won when everyone expected them to lose. They went home to silence when they deserved a nation's thanks. This is their story, finally told.